You existed before the world began, and you've got times and the seasons in your hand. You rule and reign, majestic is your name. Hey, Yahweh, my Yahweh. You've got times and seasons. You rule and reign. Hey, Yahweh. Oh, my Yahweh. Hey, you existed. You've got times and seasons. And you rule and reign. Hey, Yahweh. Lift your hands to the King tonight. Everybody say, hey, Yahweh. Oh, my Yahweh. Very simple song. Can we do it together? Hey, Yahweh. Oh, my Yahweh. Hey. Lift it up, lift it up. Everybody, hey, Yahweh. Oh, my Yahweh. Hey. Hey, Yahweh. Oh, my Yahweh.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Yahweh's House of Worship and Restoration International Ministries. It's another Sabbath afternoon, and we just want to continue to worship, to exalt, and lift up his name. So before we do so, we want to learn a bit more about him and his ways and his expectation of us. So this afternoon is our Sabbath school. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you will glean or learn something from, or it will enlighten you during our Sabbath school this afternoon. Last week, we're looking at the armor of Yahweh. So last week, the first armor we looked at was the belt of truth. And for those of you who weren't able to join us last week, I will just refresh your memories, or I will just enlighten you on what we spoke about, the belt of truth, briefly. So the belt of truth, we said, is designed to encircle us, and it's a support that holds our sword, which is the word of Yahweh. It protects us. It holds that word together. It protects and it keeps us safe. Truth allows us to follow Yahweh without deviating from the right path. When Yahweh spoke of the historic nation of Israel, he used the belt for illustration. For as the sash clings to the waist of a man, so I have caused the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah to cling to me, says Yahweh, that they may become my people, for renown, for praise, and for glory. The ancient nation of Israel had a choice to be encircled by the truth of Yahweh's word, or to embrace the deception. They chose poorly, and the nation fell to pieces as a result of this. But we don't want to do that. But that wasn't that was just the decision that Israel made. We don't want to make that choice this afternoon or ever. We want to put on the armor of Yahweh, which means dedicating ourselves to the word of truth, to speak the word of truth at all times. And whilst speaking the word of truth, it's about trusting Yahweh to guide our steps along the way, so that when we speak the word of the truth, any challenges that we face in life, we will ensure that the belt of truth is on. The challenge is, will we put on his belt of truth? And that was a question, I thought, provoking question I left you all with last week. Will you wear that belt of truth and trust Yahweh in this? So this week, we'll continue to look at the breastplate of righteousness. The breastplate of righteousness, again, is found in Ephesians, and it's in verse 14 of Ephesians 6. Having put on the breastplate of righteousness, Paul tells us to put on the breastplate of righteousness. And that must have a significant reason if Paul is encouraging us to put on the breastplate of righteousness. Remember, he wrote while he was in prison, so he had full access to see the Roman soldiers, what they looked like, and he saw the full armor that they wore. But it's very significant, the breastplate of righteousness. And I'll highlight to you a little bit more on what the breastplate of righteousness means. Because without righteousness, we leave ourselves open to Satan's attack. Without righteousness is first of all to repent. What we need righteousness, but what we need to do is to repent and ask for forgiveness of our sins, and then to do what is right in Yahweh's eyes. Psalm 119, 172 tells us that Yahweh's commandments are righteous. Yahweh's commandments are righteous. So to be righteous is to obey Yahweh's commandments. To be righteous is to obey Yahweh's laws and to receive Yahweh's love. Isaiah 59 verses 17 says that Yahweh himself put on righteousness as a breastplate. This may be part of what inspired Paul to use this analogy. Isaiah 59 starts by explaining that your iniquities, you and I iniquities, has separated us from Yahweh in verse 2 of Isaiah 59. Iniquity is the opposite of righteousness. So iniquity, again I'll say, is the opposite of righteousness. So when we give in to sin without repenting, we are removing our breastplate of righteousness and leaving ourselves open to the enemy. We're leaving ourselves open to Satan's attack. We're leaving ourselves open to all of the enemy's device. So what is the breastplate of righteousness? What is it about? It's the second element of the listed in the armor of Yahweh. What is this piece of spiritual armor, and how are we to put it on? We read it so eloquently at all times, but what does it mean for our daily lives to put on the breastplate of righteousness? And what is a breastplate to begin with? First of all, we need to understand what is a breastplate in order to fully comprehend what the breastplate of righteousness really means to us. So the Apostle Paul, he listed several pieces of the armor worn by Roman soldiers of his day. And he made an analogy about the spiritual armor needed by us as believers. The second piece of the armor is a breastplate, which is likened to righteousness. Now, I'll give you a little bit of information. soldiers of that time had another piece of protective armor to wear to ward off enemy blows, which is the shield. But during the heat of battle, those blows could come from unexpected directions, or there could be too many to ward off without just a shield. The breastplate provided protection against the unexpected and against overwhelming numbers. So the breastplate worn by a Roman soldier was generally made of iron. Though some wealthy soldiers may have worn the breastplate as a symbol, they wore it as a bronze symbol. It consisted of an overlapping pieces of metal with connecting front and back sections. These were rounded pieces which was protecting the shoulders and the breastplate, usually resting on the soldier's hip. So the entire weight wasn't carried on his shoulders, which David must be displaying for you. The overlapping pieces allowed was for more flexibility of movement. This piece of armor protected the vital organs of the body, of the soldier's body during the battle. The breastplate, I just want you to be aware that the breastplate, it defends the heart. If you see what the shape of the breastplate looks like, the vital organs of the body consist of your heart and of your lungs. And that is what the breastplate protects. So all of those vital functionalities that are contained in what is called the region of the thorax. So this is righteousness, which defends everything on which the man's spiritual existence depends. So what does the breastplate of righteousness protect us from? The Apostle Paul makes another comparison between the believer's life and warfare, and one of his letters to the Corinthians. For though we walk in this flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in Yahweh to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Yahweh. So it says everything, not just some things, but this is what the breastplate of righteousness does. It's casting down every argument in high places that exalts itself or which tries to exert itself over the knowledge and the understanding of Yahweh Elohim. It's bringing every thought into captivity, into obedience. And this is found in Corinthians 10, verses 3-5. The enemy of the believer described in these verses are numerous. There are many enemies. We've got many enemies out there, and we need to be aware of this. And they could come at us unexpectedly. They can come at us at any time, which is why Paul is encouraging us to make sure we have the breastplate of righteousness on, not just at some times, but at all times, because we are not aware. We don't know when the enemy is going to attack us. If we knew when the enemy was going to attack, we would always be physically and spiritually prepared. But he wants us to keep this breastplate of righteousness on so that we're always prepared, so we don't ever get caught out by the enemy and his devices. So how important is the breastplate of righteousness for us? Yahweh promises great reward to all of us, to all of his children who follows the pathway of righteousness. Riches, he says, does not profit in the day of wrath. It certainly doesn't. But righteousness delivers us from death. So money or whatever you have achieved in life, it doesn't protect us. It doesn't ward us from the enemy. It doesn't protect us from the attacks of the enemy. But righteousness delivers us from the enemy. The righteousness of the blameless will direct our ways always, but the wicked will fall by his own wickedness. The righteousness of the upright will deliver them. This is what the word of Yahweh says. But the unfaithful will be caught by their lust. This is in Proverbs 4, verses 4 to 6. Again, please make a note of this and take your own time to read it and understand it. So what is the definition of righteousness? The dictionaries, various dictionaries, defines righteousness as a behavior that is morally justifiable, or a behavior which is right. Such behavior which is characterized by accepted standards of integrity, of moral integrity, of justice, of virtue, or uprightness. The Bible's standard of human righteousness is Yahweh's own perfection in every attribute, in all of our attitudes, in all of our behaviors, and in all of our words, in all of our language, in everything that we do that depicts righteousness. Thus, Yahweh's laws, as given in the Bible, both describes his own characteristics, and it contributes to the plumb line by which he measures human righteousness. So, if Yahweh tells us to be righteous or to put on the breastplate of righteousness, he tells us to put it on because it's significant and it's important. And it's an important part of the armor because it covers the vital part of the organ, which is our heart and our lungs. Without our heart in our bodies, we wouldn't be able to function. The heart, as we all know, is the main function of the body, which pumps the blood around into our body, which keeps our bodies alive. Without a heart, we are dead. Without our hearts functioning properly, we are dead beings. So how are we supposed to do this? And what does it really mean to be righteous? One of the ways the Bible defines righteousness in terms of Yahweh's commandments, he says, my tongue shall speak of your word. So we will speak of his word all of the time. We will uplift his name all of the time. We will speak his language all the time. We will follow his commandments because his commandments are righteous. Psalm 119, 172 says, his commandments, all of his commandments are righteous, and we must follow them. So that shows how significant it is for us to remain righteous. Even though we strive to be perfect, you don't have to be perfect to be righteous. Some of you might be alarmed about that. Romans 3:23 tells us that all have sinned. Every single one of us on this face of this earth, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of Yahweh. That's important. It tells us that we still need to put on righteousness. Not because we sin, we mustn't put on the breastplate of righteousness. We need to still put on that righteousness, even though we are not perfect. If complete perfection were a requirement, we'd all fall short of that standard, which we all can agree. So let's note the account of Abraham as it's recorded in Romans 4. He did not waver at the promise of Yahweh through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to Yahweh, and being fully convinced that what he had promised, what he was promised by Yahweh, he was also able to perform. He was able to fulfill. And therefore, it was accounted to Abraham as righteousness. Now, this is in Romans chapter 4, verses 20 to 22. Again, take your own time, read and understand for yourself. Abraham began with an unwavering belief, which is called faith, that Yahweh could do what he said, that he didn't stop as a simple belief. Abraham based his actions in life on that faith in Yahweh Elohim. And that's what Yahweh wants us to do as his children. Hebrews 11 gives a further encounter of the relationship between Abraham's faith and his actions. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he afterward received as an inheritance. Abraham went out. He didn't know where he was going, but by faith, Abraham went out. He followed the leading of Yahweh, and that was accounted to Abraham as righteousness. Abraham dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country. A lot of us has been exposed to foreign countries. We've moved to foreign countries, and I'm sure it's by faith. We're not knowing what to expect, but we hear lovely things, and we hear things that are rewarding, and that it's going to be better for our lives. And we go in the hope and the expectation. So Abraham went in this hope and this expectation. So Abraham went out. He followed the leading of Yahweh. Abraham was dwelling in tents with his son Isaac and Jacob, So he followed Yahweh's leading. This is in Hebrews 11, verses 8 and 9. Yahweh's commandments are always righteousness. They're always righteousness for us. Abraham backed up his faith with obedience to Yahweh's commandments and all of the commandments that he had received. Now, if we do the same, it will be accounted for righteousness to us, as this was accounted to Abraham. This will be accounted to us as righteousness. So how can imperfect people be righteous? I'm sure you're asking yourselves that question. I've asked myself that question many times. How can me, being imperfect, be made righteous? It isn't surprising that Abraham was listed in the Bible as an example for us to follow as believers, as an example of righteousness. His faith and his willingness to obey Yahweh in whatever he was commanded to do, as documented, was accounted to him as righteousness. So let's look at another man who was called righteous in the Bible, whose righteousness isn't obvious at first glance. Let's consider Lot. I'm sure most of us who read our Bibles understand the story of Lot. Lot, who was listed as another righteous man. Lot's story is recorded in Genesis 19, he lived with his family in a city called Sodom, one of the cities listed, which was later destroyed by Yahweh Elohim, because that city had great wickedness in it. There's a lot of wickedness which took place in the land of Sodom, but Lot was a righteous man. He served Yahweh Elohim with righteousness and great faith. So Yahweh did not destroy Sodom before he sent his angels in to minister to Lot so that Lot could get out of Sodom before he destroyed Sodom. So that also was accounted to Lot as righteousness. In the first part of the chapter, two angels appearing in the form of men, they went to visit Lot. He fed them and he gave them a night's lodging in his house. This is in Genesis 19, verses 1 to 3. When men of the city came to the house and demanded that he sent his visitors out to them to be sexually abused, Lot actually offered his daughters. Can you believe it? Can you imagine that? Lot offered his daughters. How many of us in this day and age would do that? Let's stop to think about it. This is our daughters, our children, our precious child. But Lot saw how disgusting it was. Lot saw how unrighteous it was in the eyes of Yahweh Elohim. So Lot decided, instead of giving in to their wickedness, he would offer his daughters. So Lot offered his daughters up to these lustful men instead. But they wouldn't have it, as the story goes on. The angels struck the men of the city, struck them blind to protect Lot, and told him that he needed to get out of Sodom, he and his family. Lot initially lingered, but when the angels took him by the hand and told him to flee without looking back, Lot did so. He did so. He did not look back at what he had. He did not look back at his possessions. He didn't look back at all his wealth. I'm sure that Lot was a wealthy man. He didn't look back at all his success and what he had achieved and what he had accumulated over the years. He believed in Yahweh Elohim, that Yahweh sent his angels, and that whatever he had achieved over his lifetime, that Yahweh would bless him much more in abundance. So he followed the leading of Yahweh, and he didn't look back, and he went with the angels, according to Genesis 19, verses 4 to 16. And that was accounted to Lot as righteousness. Many of us would have looked back. Many of us would have thought, we would have said, no, this is what I have built over the years. This is what I have achieved. I cannot afford to let go of it. But there are many times in our lives when we need to let go completely of all of our success, all of our fame, all of our achievements, all of our credentials, and we need to listen to the leading of our Yahweh Elohim. Because when we let go, we then realize he's got a lot better in store for us. And this is what Lot did. So how is it that Lot came to be called a righteous man? Notice 2 Peter 2 verses 6 and 7. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live an unholy life, an unrighteous life. So he chose righteousness. Lot chose righteousness over unrighteousness. And he delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed with the filthiness and the conduct and the wickedness and the evil and the lusting of that city in Sodom. Lot had his shortcomings, just like you and I, because all of us as humans, we have shortcomings. We have a lot of shortfalls. I do, and I'm sure we all do. Yahweh considered Lot, and he considered Abraham to be righteous. And he says that righteousness must dwell among his people. So we need to be obedient to the leading of Yahweh's righteousness. So rather than adopting sinful ways around us, Lot continued, like Lot, we need to continue to obey Yahweh. Like Abraham, we need to continue to obey Yahweh. So when Yahweh commanded Lot to flee the city, leaving behind his whole life, his entire life, everything that he knew, Lot did so without looking back. His obedience to Yahweh's command and his desire to follow Yahweh's way of life made Lot a righteous man. And that breastplate of righteousness saved Lot from his destruction and his family. The righteousness of Yahweh versus the righteousness of man. Let's look at that. So what we as humans might consider to be righteous and pleasing to Yahweh doesn't always line up to Yahweh's righteousness. It doesn't necessarily line up to what we call Yahweh's righteousness. What do I mean by that? Before Paul wrote about the armor of Yahweh, before he became a follower of Yeshua the Messiah, Paul was also a Pharisee. Let's not forget that. The Pharisees were Jews who placed a heavy emphasis on obeying more than just Yahweh's commandment. They obeyed an extra set of man-made commandments. They did, on top of Yahweh's commandments. They believed that their obedience to these extra commandments would keep them from their sins. So even though they followed Yahweh's commandments, they also followed the commandments of the land, of their authority. And they believed that this kept them from their sins. And that also would make them righteous. Years after Paul's conversion, Paul wrote that his goal was to gain perfection with Yeshua and to be found in Yeshua, not having his own righteousness, but the righteousness of Yahweh. And this is found in Philippians 3, verses 8 and 9. Paul was referring to Yahweh's laws, not the man-made Pharisaical law, not the laws of the Pharisees, not the law of his country, not the laws of the high priest. And though Yahweh's laws define conduct that is righteous, even if we could keep those laws perfectly, and none of us can, by the way, we still need the cleansing of past sins that only comes through faith in Yeshua's redeeming death. As Paul explained how Abraham's faith was accounted to him for righteousness, he explained, now it is not written for his sakes alone that it was imputed to him, but also for us. It shall be imputed to us who believe in him who was raised up, Yeshua, the Messiah, from the dead, who was delivered us because of our offenses and was raised because of our justification. That's Romans 4, verses 23 to 25. In other words, our goal is to put on Yahweh's righteousness, and that righteousness becomes our own when we commit ourselves to step out in faith and to obey Yahweh's commandments, to be obedient to Yahweh's laws. How do we put on the breastplate of righteousness, you ask? Yahweh's commandments are righteous. We did say that in Psalm 119, verses 172. We can put on this breastplate by obedience, by sheer obedience to Yahweh in our lives. That's all it needs, to be obedient. So how can we begin such a task? There's an ancient proverb that says the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step in a similar way. The journey to put on the breastplate of righteousness begins with a single choice, one single choice from you and I. Now, we know that life involves a series of choices, and we can work at this one day at a time, one step at a time, by choosing with Yahweh's help to make our next choice is a righteous one. Notice again, Paul's word in 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Yahweh, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Yeshua. Every action begin with a thought, and our thought needs to be brought in line with Yahweh's words and with his commandments. Now we need to make the correct choices. Let's choose righteousness. Let's choose life. Our life, our choices, it flows in from a mind which dwells on Yahweh's word. The time which we need to start making these choices to follow Yahweh and to put on the breastplate of righteousness is now. Because as I earlier explained, the importance of having on the breastplate of righteousness, as this breastplate covers the vital organs of our bodies. It covers our heart. It covers our lungs. That tells you how important it is to follow the breastplate of righteousness. Next week, we will continue to look at the gospel of peace. The gospel of peace. Thank you very much for stopping by and for listening. I hope you have learned something from this. And I hope I've given you a little bit more insight and understanding into what the breastplate of righteousness means to you. Because a lot of the times we read these scriptures and we don't take the time out, including myself, to understand it fully. But now I've given you a little bit more insight into the breastplate of righteousness. Thank you very much for listening and have a great afternoon. Please join us at 3 p.m. for our service time. Yahweh bless you. Thank you all. Goodbye.